have with us Andrew Gunn, who is a research fellow at Monash University and is currently visiting us in Europe. So Andrew is interested in patterns that emerge from geophysical fluids, and today he will be sharing his results on the ways aeolian landscape evolution is sensitive to climate properties like temperature, precipitation, wind. Yeah, so whenever you want, Andrew.
Great, thank you. Well, thanks for inviting me to give a talk in this series. It's a great series. Love watching the videos. Even if in Australia it's hard to get the time right, I can watch them on YouTube, which is good. So today I'm going to talk about climate expressed in aeolian landscapes. And this work is it's collaborative work. It's like 3 or 4 different sort of projects. So but importantly, we've got some students in the group at Monash who have contributed. So Nicole, who did her master's on some work on Mars and Titan, and Ellie, who did her undergraduate thesis on this, and will start in her PhD soon, and Dominic, who's a PhD student in the group, and then some collaborators as well on some Martian things and some paleoclimate, and then on a particular field site, which I'll talk a little bit about too. So and here is a motivating photo of some beautiful dunes in the Rub al Khali. And if you're familiar with aeolian morphology, you'll see that there's a variety of different scales of bed forms here, which are suggestive of different types of climate. And that's something I'll start talking about to begin with. So I always like starting talks with these two lovely videos from some experiments that began in Paris, here where I am at the moment. And this first paper from that work was 10 years, I guess 15 years ago now. And there are 2 experiments which are extremely similar, apart from the difference in angle between the 2 winds, which are pushing the sand around and making bed forms, is larger on the right-hand side than the left-hand side. And that means that you get 2 different morphologies of dunes developing. You get Barcan dunes on the left, which sort of are like unimodal winds, and then linear dunes on the right, which are basically are created by 2 winds which have a divergence angle of greater than 90 degrees. And so the morphology is characteristic of the wind climate, right? So these are 2 very nice clean examples of that. And if we go to look at this type of behavior across the planet, or anywhere really where wind blows sand around, we find that there are maybe 4 sort of characteristic morphotypes that people generally look at. There's star dunes, linear dunes, transverse dunes, and Barcan dunes. And in 1983, this paper showed that as you get more unimodal wind directions and more or less sand, you can kind of populate this phase space of boundary conditions for bed forms with the types of morphologies that I just explained. So star dunes form when the winds are going all around in different directions, and there's a reasonable amount of sand, and so on, right? And then recently, this review paper, which is I would encourage you to look at if you're interested in sand dunes and you haven't seen it already. We go ahead and try and look at all the different types of dunes and what sort of processes or boundary conditions lead to those different types of dunes. And the idea is that you can find the shapes. Hopefully, you can find the shapes and work your way backwards in this flow chart to understand what conditions led to their shapes, and then you can do what we love to do in geomorphology, which is find out about climate from landscapes. Cool. So that's a little motivating sort of explanation of broad sort of aeolian landscapes work. But I'm going to sort of show that those nice examples that we just looked at in nature, it's very hard to find them always. And here's a great illustration of this, like cherry-picked examples. So here's a sort of ideal Barken dune in North Africa. And this is the corresponding sand flux rose, which is kind of like the wind directions. And it's perfectly in the direction you would expect for this type of sand dune. And then here is a Barken dune as well. It looks pretty similar. And the corresponding flux rose for this area is very multimodal and would, if you just saw the flux rose, you would expect to see star dunes, but instead we see this Barken morphology. And so the question is like, why? Why do we see this? What is the reason? Is it, yeah, that, and we'll get into that. But the point here, I guess, the sort of implications of this, so that the representation of the contemporary surface and the contemporary winds don't necessarily always match. And not only that, but the stratigraphic record, which is built inside this stratigraphy, is not currently inside this dune. The stratigraphy is majority looks like a Barken dune, but the contemporary climate is not that at all. So if you were trying to interpret past climate from stratigraphic record, it might also be an issue. So now what I'll do is I'll show for all the giant dunes on Earth, the same graph that I showed before, that 1983 graph, which has the, you know, how unidirectional the winds are on the x-axis and how much sand there is on the y-axis. And these crosses are the ones that were in that original paper. And all these dots are like, you know, a little region of Earth, like a square region from, and we've identified the dune shape and the amount of sand that's there, as well as what the flux directionality is, how unimodal the flux is, and the colors are consistent across the dune morphology. So I also identified the morphology of all these dunes, right? And so these are all the dunes on Earth that are greater than 90 meters wide, and the crosses and the dots don't line up, which is really frustrating, right? You would expect if everything's in equilibrium, you know, that we would have a nice correspondence between the contemporary climate and the dunes that we see on the surface, and we don't really find that here. And I guess the fact that they don't line up is less important than the fact that there's a very large spread in the cloud of a respective colored dot, right? So the linear dunes we see have way, you know, have different values across this whole region, for example. And question is why? So we can't predict climate from dunes always. That's, I guess, the take-home result from this figure. The reason I would pose for that is explained in this figure, so in this slide. So I need to sort of back up and explain what the reconstitution time of a dune is. So dune's a bed form that's eroding on one side and depositing on another, and it's sort of, you know, migrating as a response to that. And the time it takes for it to migrate in, you know, one of its wavelengths in the direction of the net transport is what we call the reconstitution time. It's the time it takes for a dune to migrate one wavelength. And if we use the data that was in the previous plot and some you know, some other parameters that are in this paper, you can build this distribution, probability distribution of the reconstitution time for all these giant dunes on Earth. And the peak of this distribution is around, you know, maybe 20,000 years, 30,000 years. This is a log scale. And that time scale is pretty long with respect to the time that climate is changing in some places, right? We have variability in climate in dune fields around that time scale. And so maybe some of the reasons why the dunes don't look the way that they should with respect to the current climate is that they've somehow inherited the forcing of climate in the past that wasn't necessarily the same. In some parts of the world, that's okay. And in other parts, because the climate doesn't change much. And then in other parts of the world, it's actually quite a big deal, potentially. So I'm going to focus first on one place where that's a really interesting thing to study. and that's the Rub al Khali, which is and only one section of the Rub al Khali. So it's down, in the UAE and Yemen and Saudi Arabia and Oman. And this part of the Rub al Khali has this really nice, interesting pattern for the wind field, which is in the red lines, and it's that you have convergence of two dominant types of flow features of the climate. You have monsoonal winds coming from the Indian Ocean in the south, and then you have the Shamal winds from the north meeting in this sort of nice saddle node in the center of the study area that we're looking at. And also, as they do that, the average winds slow down. And so there's generally deposition of aeolian sediments in this region, and you're building a dune field. And in this place, we have a bunch of different morphologies of dunes, which are colored in these in this map here and in this color bar. And the point here is to try and explain these morphologies with respect to this present climate and these different types of flow features. Also, it's a pretty relevant place for paleoclimate because it's part of this larger story about the expansion of Homo sapiens from and other human species from Africa. So on that sort of timescale that we're talking about, right, the hundreds of thousands of years sort of timescale. So yeah, as I explained, or as I sort of noted kind of crudely in the previous slide, I want to define three timescales here, and the first one is the one I already talked about, the bed form reconstitution time. It's the time it takes for dunes to migrate one wavelength. So that's the length divided by the speed. And then there's also this formation time, which is the amount of time it would take to deposit the thickness of sand that exists in a place. So, if we have convergence or divergence of sand flux, the gradient in the sand flux leads to deposition, like the Exner equation, just mass balance. And then if you look at the rate that you have that vertical motion with respect to the thickness, you can get a time scale out of that. It's the time it would take to erase or to produce the amount of sand that exists there. And then finally, this sort of draft timescale for the climate that's relevant for dune growth. And this is the time that the net transport direction of sand stays pretty consistent. And so it's the, if the net transport direction veers away as the climate is changing, once it veers away a certain amount, we say, okay, no longer are we in the same climate for dunes. And the time it took to do that is called we're calling here the climate persistence time. Cool. Okay, so we have these three timescales, right? And if we take the topography data and the reanalysis wind data for the contemporary climate, we can actually calculate all of these timescales, and we end up with some graphs like this. So this is a map of that deposition rate, so the erosion and deposition rate in this region. And you can see it's mostly red because of that convergence of the winds. And then we have the speed that the dunes are migrating based off of the flux and their size. And then we have these two timescales at the bottom. This is the time it would take to erase or produce the sand in the dune field, given these rates above. And you can see the timescales here are pretty long, and the distribution is pretty wide. And these are log scales on the bottom of these probability distributions here. And then in the bottom right, we have the reconstitution time, that one that I said, how long it takes for a dune to migrate. And in this location, interestingly, we have some places where the reconstitution time well exceeds the interglacial timescale. And that's pretty interesting because these two types of winds that produce the dune field are definitely known to vary pretty substantially with the glacial interglacial time, with those sort of larger boundary conditions of the climate. So the dunes move or rework slower than the climate that forces them is reworking in some places, not in all places. So a nice example of that is the figure that the Barken dune that I showed you to motivate how they're in disequilibrium, which is here. So the timescale for this part of the dune field is 300,000 years. This is the same figure that I had in the title slide of the talk, and that those dunes are around in this part of the region where the reconstitution times are really long. I think this arrow has moved slightly as I moved the figures around, sorry. But we can also look to paleoclimate models to sort of verify this idea. So this is the HAD-CM3 model from the Bristol Paleoclimate Group. And this is work with Joe Neal, the paleoclimatologist at Melbourne Uni. And what we have plotted here is the net flux direction, which is, oh, I don't know if this is, oh, it's, yeah, I think the videos aren't working properly, but those time series on the left are plotting it as a function of time for 3 points, which are in the middle of the dune field. They're colored the same. And you can see that the place where the Shamal winds is dominant from the north and where the monsoon is dominant from the south, those winds are relatively consistent in direction. But the one in the middle of the dune field is flipping around with the interglacial time, and it's flipping around on a timescale faster than the reconstitution time of the dunes. And so this is why I think the giant dunes look wrong for the contemporary climate, because they're still catching up, basically. So we can take the ratios of these three timescales and plot this phase diagram of the relative effects. So kind of like some non-dimensional numbers, and we can try and understand what sort of stratigraphic record is left behind by these dunes, and whether or not the contemporary climate would produce stratigraphy that is representative of the climate now. And sorry, yeah, that's right. And so these red dots, based off of those paleoclimate simulations and all the other analysis, are all the different grid cells inside the dune field. And these sort of regions that I've drawn are like the expectation of what would be right or wrong. So the closer you are to the bottom left here, you have higher you have long, like really consistent climate and really short dune reconstitution times, and then and you also have really thick sets relative to the migration rate of the dune. As the dune is as the stratigraphy is being built vertically, you're seeing a lot of that being left behind because the dunes don't migrate fast relative to that building formation timescale. So you'd have great preservation of very consistent climate. And you can see that the red dots for this dune field here don't really get down to this region very, very easily. And there's plenty of places where actually the time that the climate is consistent for is shorter than the reconstitution time. So that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, so I think this is a good explanation for why a lot of the dunes on Earth don't look correct, and if and where on Earth you should be able to accurately try and measure the effect of climate from dunes, or like what the climate is from dunes. And also go looking for places where you may be able to see like sort of reasonable timescale climate variability on the smaller bed forms superimposed on larger dunes, because those have shorter reconstitution timescales, of course, because they're smaller, experiencing a similar amount of sand flux. Yeah, so that's quite nice location. It's a great study site. And now I'm going to focus on a second study area, which is where people have used aeolian landscapes to try and infer climate change for quite a long time. So that same Wasson from the phase diagram and some other people have studied for going on 40 years now, and actually before the linear dune field that covers a third of Australia's continent. And the orientation of those dunes is shown here in this graph by Bob and ADA. And you can see that it has this very nice whirl sort of shape, like a fingerprint sort of shape, where the dunes are sort of flowing like that over a lot of the continent. And the idea that's been posed is that, the monsoons from monsoonal flows from the north and the westerlies across the south of the continent, as well as the continentality effect on the climate, have produced this well shape, and that the latitudinal sort of position of this entire whirl is actually more representative of when the monsoons and the westerlies were further north, during the glacial climate, because the poles were colder. And so the fact that you've moved your cells of the climate further north as the poles get colder would be suggestive of this location rather than one that's further south, which hypothetically would be today. And you can see that when you look at the orientations of dunes in certain places that are older and younger, adjacent to one another. So this is an idea that's been around for a while, but what I want to get at now is whether or not we can test this effectively with newer understanding of sand fluxes from wind data. So I'm going to focus on a smaller region for a second, which is still massive, bigger than most countries, and this is dune field, which in the colonial speak is called the Great Victoria Desert, named after the Queen. And it's a big dune field that covers lots of Aboriginal country, so it has a lot of different names. But it's a thin drape of sediments produced in the Quaternary, sourced from Paleo Valley fills from the Cenozoic. And it covers this big region, and there's lots of linear dunes through here that have these nice sort of different morphologies across it, but also there's these beautiful burn scars that are superimposed on there, which are from when fire comes through and burns this arid vegetation, and sort of like brush strokes, which are nice. So we're going to look at these. We're going to look at these dunes in a little bit of detail, and the way that we do this again is with very similar sort of method as the previous talk, which is to look at the sand flux from contemporary reanalysis data as well as the topography data, because this data is pretty accurate and available across the entire planet for free, right? And we also use some other data like multispectral satellite data for fire and vegetation effects, which I'll get into in a second. So yeah, you can see how individual weather events lead to sand transport across this region, which are, stare at this video for hours. I hope it isn't too laggy for you on the other side of the internet. Okay, so for a given place, that whole beautiful, pattern, that video can be distilled down into a single statistical windrows that looks like this, let's say. And this windrows can be turned into a flux rose by looking at the way that the wind speed or friction velocity is related to sand flux. So we filter this windrows through this relationship, and then we can build a sand flux rose, which is like a probability rose, which is shown here in the bottom. And as we change the threshold wind speed, the net orientation of the sand flux can vary. And in this particular place, it can vary really substantially. And in fact, the orientation of the dunes can swing from being in this direction at low thresholds to being in this direction for high thresholds. And completely erodible sand of this grain size in this location can be moved at around like sort of 0.2, 0.3 meters per second friction velocity. And so we wouldn't expect a threshold velocity to be lower than this really, but if you have vegetation or something in the way, the threshold can definitely be above 0.5. The effective threshold can be above 0.5 meters per second. So the effect of vegetation can be to totally swing this orientation around, but the windrows that produce these is constant, right? So just varying the threshold can completely change the orientation and morphology of your dunes, which is pretty cool. And so to illustrate that in the field, I have this nice example, which is linear dunes in the middle of this dune field that are all going in this direction. And you can tell the sign of that orientation by whether or not the junctions of the dunes are, they're like Y junctions, and the 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 the, the bottom of the Y is pointing always in the net sand transport direction. And then on this little meso, so the dunes are about 5 meters high, and this like sort of rise here is about 8 meters high, so not that much higher than the dunes. On top of this, there's less groundwater, and so there's a free dune here, an unvegetated dune on top of it, and it has slip faces, which you can see down here, which suggests that the wind direction is actually in the orientation of the red arrow. So this is potentially due to the fact that this is an unvegetated dune. And as we vary the threshold wind speed in this location, we can see that the net orientation of the sand flux for the same windrows, of course, would go through what the orientation of the free dune is at low friction velocities, and which are around the one you would expect for free sand. And then it swings down and it goes to the orientation that the linear dunes are at for high thresholds, which would be consistent with having vegetation. So this is quite nice. But the thing that's really important here, right, is that if you're trying to measure this huge linear dune orientation pattern across the continent, if there's variability in the vegetation in time or in space, you can't just take the winds and turn them into a dune orientation map, because you don't know what the threshold is in the past or in the time. So perhaps this potential, latitudinal shift in the climate with the glacial and interglacial cycles, perhaps that didn't happen. Perhaps it was just that the vegetation changed with the glacial and interglacial. It changed the threshold and it changed the dune orientation. So that's kind of confusing. It adds like another layer of, it makes the problem unconstrained, right? You no longer have the same number of free parameters as you have, constraints, right? So to just go ahead and assume the null hypothesis that the wind climate hasn't changed, we can take the orientations of the dunes in this region, and we can take the windroses locally. Don't really, yeah. The plots on the left are a little complicated. Maybe just ignore them for now. I don't want to run over time. And the plots on the right, though, this is the dune orientation map. And if we find the threshold friction velocity that makes that windrows have a flux orientation which matches the dune orientation, so we solve for the threshold to make them match, then this is what that map is. This is the map of the threshold that makes the wind climate produce a dune that's observed. And you can see this nice gradient in the thresholds from 0.2-ish to 0.8 meters per second, which is pretty remarkable. And now we want to explain this map. Can the vegetation explain this map? Because if so, then maybe the wind climate hasn't changed at all in this location, right? To try and understand this, we look at the fire over this dune field, as well as the precipitation and the NDVI, so the measure of the vegetation greenness, which isn't always really well related to how much the vegetation stops the wind transporting sand. And so we try and compare these maps to the friction threshold velocity map. And what we find is that, the precipitation actually doubles across the dune field, and the fire is non-existent where it's drier, and actually there's more fire where it's wetter. And there's also some influence of humans. This part of the dune field has a lot of cultural Aboriginal burning as well, which it contributes to the fire. And it's not just lightning that's causing fire, it's humans too. And this map shows that the fire is fuel limited. So actually the fire and the rain are correlated, which is kind of sometimes counterintuitive, but in arid environments, that's very common. And the pattern of the fire is shown here. It's this beautiful map of overprinting of burn scars. And so I think that this sort of high, low, high threshold map here is actually explained by this linear trend in with east to west in the fire, because the fire, frees the surface of vegetation and therefore reduces the effective, like time averaged threshold potentially. And on the left, we have quick recovery on the western side where there's lots of fire but lots of rain. You have quick recovery of the vegetation, and you have less time where the where the wind can access the dunes, even though there's plenty of fire. On the eastern side, we have no fire at all, but very little, still half the amount of rainfall. So we have vegetation there, but it's never uncovered. The dunes are never uncovered. And then in the middle, you have this place where there's plenty of fire, but there's the largest fraction of time where the vegetation isn't covering the dunes because there's plenty of the recovery time is long, right? And that would make the effective threshold velocity be lower. So that's pretty nice. I think this works, but the NDVI map doesn't really show this extremely obviously, but there is higher NDVI where it counterintuitively in the wrong place, but still working on understanding that completely. But this leads to a very complex sort of filtering of vegetation on the dunes' response to the climate, and indeed, as the climate changes, the vegetation changes too. So it becomes a very complicated problem to try and back out the what climate these dunes represent. Just to make things a little bit more confusing, we have this very nice region of Mythica country in this part of Australia. So this is in the north, in the interior northeast, sorry, and in the southwest of Queensland. And there's this dry lake here that has a river feeding it, and the sediment from this dry lake gets blown out into this dune field here, and these linear dunes elongate away from the lake. And interestingly, they actually end up migrating back into the river. And so you have this nice reworking of the recycling of the sediment potentially. But what we wanted to do here was understand the rate that this landscape is developing and what the climate was like in the past from it, because that's relevant work for the Mythica people to understand the context for the archaeology in this landscape. And we find that these dunes are old. They've been around for as long as humans have in the continent, and as known, and they're elongating away at some rate, which is nice, but the rate that they elongate, just sort of a thought experiment, is kind of how it's related to aridity, which is something we're trying to infer, is kind of complicated, because if you have a really dry climate, you might expect that the wind blowable fraction of the river's sediments will be sort of used up. And there wouldn't be any new fresh supply of sediment to be added to the dune field. So you might have supply limited growth of this dune field. And then if it's too wet, then you might have plenty of supply, but there might be no availability for the wind because the sediment is always covered in a lake. And also there'd be more vegetation on the dunes, which might make them harder to move by wind. So somewhere in between, it might be the optimal sort of case for the rate that the dunes grow, which we can try and infer from their elongation rates from doing OSL. So maybe just the aeolian features themselves it isn't that clear how they would respond to waxing and waning aridity in this location. So not their orientation, but their sort of morphodynamics might be kind of a complex response to climate change. But I will note, because I know a lot of people don't do aeolian work here, I might tell you something nice about this dune field, which is really cool, which is that this river, even though it's supplying the sediment to the dunes, which are elongating away, it also floods pretty regularly. You can see this big wide floodplain here. And as it floods, it builds out levees and big mud drapes from the floodwaters. And the linear dunes act as flood drape corridors. So as the linears are elongating, the space between them gets filled with that flood drape and gets filled with mud. But they're almost I think they're almost kind of like avulsion sort of corridors, because if you look at the cross-sectional topography of this one dune, you can see that on one side of the dune, the interdune is about 8 meters higher than on the other side. So when the floods happen, the flood waters get diverted down one of the single dunes, between a pair of dunes, but not down the other potentially. And then as you move further into the dune field, the flood drape, of course, is reducing in deposition rate. And so the swale of the dune, the interdune, has less mud deposit, and eventually you get to the lake, and there's none of that at all. And this is what the actual underlying aeolian topography looks like below that flood drape. But we can tell that these dunes have been growing as the floods have been happening. So we know that there has to have been water around as the dunes were growing, because the fact that the dunes have impeded the flood drape from having this consistent shape across the underneath the dunes. So it's beautiful though, because you know, you walk around and you walk onto one side of the crest and it's like meters and meters lower because there's been no flood water accessing it. And I think maybe we date the flood drapes instead of the dunes because it might be easier to interpret. Um, so, but it's a cool place because of course it's the river that causes the dunes to grow in a way. So it's this nice sort of coupled interaction over time. All right. So quickly, I will move on to a final region, but I'll first say, of course, we can do this dune orientation across the entire continent like that nice whirl, but with more accurate data. And we can use the contemporary wind roses to build out the orientation dunes would have to expect under a certain threshold. And we can try and match these together and get this effective threshold map across the entire continent and try and tease out how this was related to vegetation and actually work on trying to, as best we can, using some new methods I haven't shown here, try and constrain this problem more. But this is the work of Dominic, PhD. Yeah. But okay, so quickly, I'll talk about, I said in my abstract, I would talk about Mars. So I'll just talk quickly about the inferring the winds on Mars. So katabatic winds, which are similar to turbidity currents, are relevant for the growth of dunes on Mars. And we can find that the dunes are super active. You know, they're moving around on Mars, which is really cool because it's a dry and cold place. Even though the pressure in the atmosphere is low, the wind speeds can be high and the gravity is lower, so you can move sand relatively easily by wind. And the fastest winds are these katabatics. And the reason for that is that there's very large daily cycles in the temperature because there's very little insulation of the climate. And that leads to these very cold nighttime surface winds, air, and that tends to hug the topography and flow down like a turbidity current. And in craters, we find that the dunes are well oriented with the slopes of the craters when the crater is steep. So and the dunes become misaligned with the regional winds outside of the craters when the crater is deeper, which is a good suggestion that these are important across the entire planet of Mars. But they're of course most relevant for around the North Pole where the winds are coldest, and indeed the katabatic winds on Earth are fastest winds on Earth too, but they're only really seen mostly in Antarctica and in some alpine valleys too. But we want to understand the pathways that these winds move sediments around on Mars, and we do that from the dune orientations because the reconstitution time of dunes on Mars is far shorter than on Earth, so that we generally think they're in equilibrium with the current winds. We're talking like 100 Martian years is the peak of the probability distribution of the reconstitution time I talked about earlier. And so we can look at the orientation of a bunch of aeolian features across the North Pole, measured from wind streaks, transverse dunes, Barken dunes, wind streaks from Viking here, and slip faces from CTX. And we can take this sort of irregularly scattered data of orientations, and we can turn it into an interpolated field, which we can get the pathways from, which is shown here in red. And so these are the pathways of aeolian transport on the North Pole of Mars. And the dune field around the North Pole is the largest dune field in the solar system. It surrounds the entire North Pole. And so the biggest aeolian system in our solar system is flowing along these pathways, which are inferred from the orientation of the dunes themselves. And you can see how the chasm of the North Pole is causing the winds to flow down into the chasm, and the dunes are ripping fast out of there because these winds are very fast. And we also see how Coriolis deflects the winds around, to the right in the North Pole, away as they move away from the pole where Coriolis force is most apparent nearest the poles. Cool. So that's the wind field that we can, or the climate pathways field we can infer from the dunes. And if we want to try and explain that, because we don't have reanalysis data on Mars to just nicely try and verify with, right? We have to actually infer that from the dunes. It's a real test of our understanding. And we're talking predominantly about Coriolis and katabatic flow. So you should be able to just infer this from latitude and from slope, right? So if we take the along slope paths, so this is from the smaller topography, and the across slope paths in the direction that Coriolis would deflect in the north, which is, our purely geostrophic flow, we expect that under, depending on the inertia of the flow, the orientation of these pathways should be some direction between the blue ones and the green ones. And we do find that, but the relationship isn't sort of the way we expect it to be completely. And that's a bit of a conundrum. So we want to ask ourselves why that might be. And I think the reason is sort of wrapped up in another threshold effect, which is due to the CO2 frost. So I'll show you a nice stitched together video from Marcy of as we go from winter into spring, the CO2 frost front, which is this big white area, retreats poleward and exposes the dark regions, which are the dunes. And we see the lofting of a bunch of amazing dust storms as well, which you can see there too. And it's because the fastest winds generally seem to coincide with, at a given latitude, with when the frost front retreats back. And so we ask, well, what is the formative wind pattern that produces the dune orientation? Is it the one that is happening when the frost front retreats? Because of course, when the dunes are frosty, they're not being moved by wind, no matter how fast it is. So the frost is somehow masking or modulating like what climate these dunes actually represent. And that we've tried to demonstrate this with the mesoscale climate models in the North Pole, and it's not super obvious how. And yeah, so this pathways map, the question is still unanswered. What climate does this really represent? Some part of the modern climate, some seasonally modulated part of the modern climate. Okay, so to summarize, the point of this talk is to try and understand how you can learn climate from dunes, and I've sort of shown you that it can be kind of complicated, but we have reason, we can explain why it's complicated, but we may not know how to overcome those complications yet. But we can see on the North Pole of Mars and on the South Pole of Earth, the biggest dune field on Earth is the snow dunes in Antarctica, the linear dunes, which Marine Posach, she had an excellent paper about this recently. And those dunes are being deflected the opposite way because they're in the other pole. And across, Australia, we have our monsoons and our westerlies that also are important. And these flow paths are all based off of the actual dunes themselves, as are these ones. This is Titan, the equatorial dunes of Titan, by Jani and her master's students. And Lior with the Barken dunes across the surface of Mars, we have the orientations of all around the planet there too. And this is by the wind data, not by the dune orientation. But in all of these cases, it's not clear what climate they totally represent. It's sort of case by case you have to understand based off of these complications. But indeed, definitely in the Rub' Kali and on Mars and on Titan, the mean winds are not represented by these dunes at all. These are made by equinox storms. These are slope-driven winds, not the large-scale synoptic weather. And here the dunes are relic of a past climate in a lot of places. And that's not really obvious for Australia yet. So I hope you got to see how in aeolian science we try and interpret climate from dunes. And thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for this great talk. So the chat is now open for questions. Please write your questions in the chat and we'll read them for you. In the meantime, so I'm very far from that kind of geomorphology. geology, so I'm sorry if my question is very basic, but I was wondering, like, when you had like this first case study with the saddle point, if you see like some kind of like gradient of reconstruction, of reconstitution time that is varying between like the part where the wind is almost the same all the time and something that is shifting, and if that helps you inform the study.
Yeah, absolutely. So wait, let me go back to that slide. So it's a really interesting question. So first of all, like this saddle node, yeah, so this is the mean winds, right? So the saddle is expressed as like the mean. But because it's a saddle, like locally, the time series of wind directions there is pretty variable, right? And it averages out to be slow and have a different direction. And so those are places where the net sand transport magnitude is actually quite low because the winds are moving sand like back and forth. And so, yeah, the reconstitution time there is actually quite long because the net transport rate is low because it's just back and forth all the time. So you're totally right. You can see, and then of course there's differences in wind speeds and differences in how the morphology of the dune varies the flux and stuff. So it's not completely linked, but you can see that, yeah, closer to this saddle area, up here, for example, there are higher rates. And where the winds are fast and up here, they're very consistent in this direction, the reconstitution times are lowest. But it also folded into that is the dune geometry, right? So it's not a silly question at all. You're totally right. It's a nice thing. And then also, I guess, one thing to note is that because the climate has this sort of scale invariance in some sense, even on extremely long time scales, the parts of the landscape where parts of the climate where the wind has variability on 10,000 year timescales is also places where the wind has variability on annual timescales. So that means that there's this very sort of subtle and interesting effect where the climate timescale, would make where the climate timescale is short, the reconstitution times will be long potentially because they have variability on all timescales. Yeah.
Great.
Okay, thank you very much.
So we have a question in the chat from Daniel Bellamy. So this is a question. Do you anticipate much annual decadal variability in the frost front in Mars? And how does that compare to climatic variability you see on Earth, moderating when the dunes can move?
Yeah. Well, it's a good question. We don't have that many years of observations of the frost front on Mars yet, so decadal variability is something we can't ascertain. But this graph here in the top here, this is the I've labeled it as frostiness, but this is the the brightness of these images at a given latitude over time, and or maybe they're not. It's not exactly this satellite data. It's a different type of satellite data, but where you have this drop off as the LS is the solar longitude, so it's seasonal. It's a measure of time annually. So yeah, you go from winter to spring, and you see that the drop off here is pretty consistent. Maybe it's varying by like a few weeks in a given location, in this location here. So the frost front retreat might be quite what's the word? Quite consistent, but only on the years we've measured. So these are the 7 years that it's been measured for, Martian years, and then here is a graph of the sand flux measured directly from the dunes at different locations as it varies throughout the year in the North Pole. And so there's a lot of interannual variability in the actual sand flux. And I'm not sure if this can be completely it can't be surprising if this is completely explained by a relatively consistent drop-off in the frostiness. It's probably more about the variability in the winds and the temperature of the pole and stuff, but it's not clear totally. And how that compares to the climate variability we see on Earth. I think, well, at least with vegetation on Earth, that's quite a complex response because it's usually due to drought, which is, affected by numerous climate variables which vary over different timescales. And so if it's just frost, I think that the effect of frost is probably more consistent than the variability on Earth in Earth's dune fields. But we don't have a lot of like frost-controlled dunes on Earth. There are some in the Arctic Circle up in northern Alaska and Canada, as well as there are a few basaltic sand dune fields that have frost in Iceland and in Antarctica. So maybe there we could test that sort of intrinsic, consistent, or comparable variability.
Okay, so it seems like there's a second question here by Daniel. How much aeolian geomorphologists being tempted to study other planetary bodies instead, where confounding factors might not be as tricky?
Yeah, I think they're interested in the other planets. I mean, yeah, so one reason is right. Maybe the confounding factors aren't as tricky, but they're also harder to observe. So it can maybe counteract that. But every rocky body in the solar system that has an atmosphere that we've observed the surface of has sand dunes, or bed forms. It has bed forms. And even the ones that don't have even like a proper atmosphere, ones that comets that as they rotate, the volatiles sublimate and it produces like very slow, very tiny flows, but the gravity is so weak that you actually get bed forms on them. You can see bed forms on those, and people study those. So yeah, everybody is very happy to study them everywhere. But also because I think they're inherently like it's easier than maybe like some other types of geomorphology where you need to know the topography, right? Whereas if you just have a photo of like the wavelength of a bed form, you can learn a lot in aeolian geomorphology just from that. So there are definitely places we study it. Yeah, I think that's true. The only place where I should be clear about that, Pluto looks like it has aeolian dunes. But we might not think they're dunes. They're like sublimation and condensation based bed forms that are more like ice scallops in subglacial channels or things like that. So they may not be like really sedimentary dunes. The jury's still out on that. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I don't know if Tamara and Pedro, you have questions. There's no more questions in the chat so far.
I mean, I had a silly question about the types of vegetation. You were sort of like, talking about how your thresholds might be controlled by the presence or absence of vegetation. But I guess that there's like a spectrum in there as well, right? And so I was wondering if that's something you looked into. The kinds of vegetation you would get, and how big they get, how widespread they get, etc.
For sure. I guess the thing that we can rely on a little bit in dune fields is that even if they're vegetated, they're still really arid. And so you don't get like full, like segregated canopy style, like vegetation that you have in rainforests or in fluvial landscapes that vary in, how temperate they are and stuff. But there is still plenty of species variability, especially in the grasses. And so in Australia, the majority of the dune fields are covered in like types of gum trees or mulga or spinifex grasses. And it's confusing because then these different species not only have different effects on the wind, but they also have different resistances to fire and different timescales of growth. And they also, like, some of them have tap roots where they basically will live forever no matter how dry it gets on sort of decadal timescales, and others will die under drought of like we have interannual drought here. So yeah, it's complicated. I think one step at a time. I mean, so but by far the most sort of surface cover species across the entire continent is like just types of spinifex, which is like a very, harsh like grass that's like spiky. Similar to like like a mesquite grass, in the southwest of um the US and in Mexico and stuff like that. And which also covers dune fields there. And so I think to first approximation, we can kind of assume there's some representative type of vegetation. It's a can of worms. Like there's different types of vegetation grow in different on the crest of the dune versus in the interdune. And in certain parts of Australia, you can see that the burn scars themselves have been the fire has been steered by the topography of the dunes. So the fire will flow down the corridor between the dunes, just like how the flood drape did in certain examples. But the hope is that you can average over all of that on long time scales. Maybe, yeah.
I have a
Cool.
question,
Thanks.
Andrew. Really, really interesting to see how I think I'm trying to understand how we can solve this unconstrained problem when you cannot rely on the morphology of the dunes to explain either the present or the past, and might be like a combination of the transition times. I don't know if that makes sense, but like when you show this dune at the beginning that looks like the perfect, yeah, this is what we expect with the north, with the direction of the winds. This is representing modern winds. And then you have this other one that doesn't look like what we expect for the modern climate. If you don't have climate reconstructions to have an idea of how was the past, or maybe you have, but then your dune morphology doesn't match either the past or the present. How is the middle, yeah, like that transition dune, like how can we know that, yeah, how much information we can try to like get out when nothing match anything?
Nothing.
Nothing, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure. But I get what you're saying. Like you're like, how do we proceed even? So I think we just need to come up with new ways of studying the landscape. I mean, one thing is that there's only so much you can do by looking at the topography from above, right? I think if we go in and we start dating sediments and looking at other properties such as like the types of sand grains that are in there, calcrete and silcrete precipitation, which happens due to more temperate environments. Looking at there's all sorts of other sort of sedimentological proxies that people have used to try and get better understanding of past climate from aeolian systems than just the geomorphology, right? So I think the geomorphology can only take you so far. But I would say that in this example, one extra thing you can do, which I haven't really just sort of like threw it out there as like a final sentence in a paper, but haven't tried, is that I think because the reconstitution time of the dunes here depends on the length scale, you sort of look at the orientation of the features. I can see Julia in the audience, so this would interest her for the superimposed bed forms. But you look at the orientation of the crests of the dunes as a function of their length scale, which linearly goes like the reconstitution time, and then you say, well, the largest dunes represent one type of wind, and that corresponds to this time scale, and then you work your way down, and it shortens the time scale to the more contemporary thing, and then that's more representative of all the way down to impact ripples, which which recalibrate like on the order of like minutes, right? And so you can have this long sort of maybe even reconstruct the climate just from the orientation of the binforms and use a time for length scale substitution. So that's one thing, maybe. But but yeah.
Cool.
I don't
Yeah.
know. It's a good question. But yeah, you have to rely on other stuff, I think. Yeah.
Well, we have Julia who's really saying to you, let's do it. So I think you have someone in. And you
Nice.
have like a last minute question from Bruce Wilkinson on any feeling for how many cycles fluvial to stream to aeolian sand might go into that Australian example.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know. It's a really important question for the Australian dunes. I don't know if I have a nice photo of this somewhere, but lots of the dune fields in Australia are like, you know, emanating away from fluvial sources, and there's lots of adjacent rivers. So they just kind of feed one another and intersect and rework. One idea is that you can use the color, like the redness of the sand grains, to try and get at that, but we need to understand that better, I think. So I don't have a number. I'm sorry. Some number that's pretty. I think it's confusing. More than one. More than one. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think we've exhausted the questions. So thank you very much. That was a super interesting talk. And I think we're meeting next week. Yeah, 26 will be the last seminar of this series. Thank you, Andrew, for this talk.
Thanks, everyone.
Very cool.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. That was great.
Thank you
Thanks
so
for asking.
much.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Yep, yep.
I'm gonna stop
I have to run
recording.
now, but it's good to see you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You too. Hopes
To
everything's
catch
well.
up sometime.
Yeah,
Yeah,
for sure.
everything's going all right. Yeah.